The spreadsheet didn't lie. That was the problem. $47 million in discrepancies, buried across 16 shell accounts, camouflaged behind the kind of accounting language designed to make regulators' eyes glaze over. Most people would have needed a forensic team and 6 months to find it. Harriet Odom found it on a Tuesday afternoon while eating a gas station sandwich at her desk in the basement of the Kellerman building, where the ceiling tiles were water-stained and the fluorescent lights flickered every time someone ran the copy machine on the floor above. She printed nothing. She said nothing. She saved the file to her personal encrypted drive, finished her sandwich, and went back to cross-referencing the subsidiary ledgers like nothing had happened. That was Harriet's gift and her curse. She could see the shape of a lie the way other people saw weather coming. Numbers told her everything. They always had. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and wore a size 22. She had a master's degree in financial mathematics from Penn State, a CPA license, and a second certification in forensic accounting she'd earned online while working double shifts at a diner to pay off her student loans. She'd applied to 43 firms before Kellerman Financial Services hired her, not for their main floor, not in the glass-walled analyst pods where the young MBAs competed over standing desks and cold brew subscriptions, but down here, in what everyone called the dungeon, processing compliance audits that nobody upstairs wanted to touch. They gave her the work nobody else would do. She did it better than anyone they'd ever had. Nobody knew that yet, or rather, nobody upstairs knew it. Down here, the 2 other dungeon accountants, a soft-spoken man named Earl who was 4 years from retirement, and a nervous young woman named Preeti who was clearly overqualified and clearly terrified. They knew. They'd seen Harriet catch a transposition error in a 900-page audit that 2 senior partners had signed off on. They'd watched her rebuild a corrupted dataset from memory, because she'd read it once and simply retained it. They didn't talk about it much. It felt like watching something you weren't supposed to see. The 47 million was different, though. That wasn't an error. That was architecture. 3 floors above Harriet's desk, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Dominic Ashcroft was having what his assistant privately described as one of those days where it's better to just cancel everything and send everyone home. Dominic was 44, the kind of man who had been described as formidable so many times in business press that the word had lost all meaning. He'd built Ashcroft Capital from a 2-person operation in a rented office into a firm that managed $9 billion in assets across 3 continents. He was relentlessly precise, legendarily impatient, and had fired 2 CFOs in the last 18 months for what he called a fundamental inability to see the obvious. Right now, the obvious was being denied to him by a team of 6 people who were all talking at once. "The SEC inquiry comes in 48 hours, said his general counsel, a grey-haired woman named Patricia who never visibly panicked, which made her current tight jaw extremely alarming. If we cannot account for the movement through the Kellerman audit trail, I know what it means, Patricia. Then we need the audit records from Kellerman before their compliance department closes for the weekend, which is in," she checked her watch, 4 hours. "We've been calling them for 6 days, I know. Their compliance director is apparently on medical leave. I know. Their senior auditor referred us to their general inquiry line, which has been on hold. I know." Dominic stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at nothing. "What I don't know is why not one of the 6 people currently standing in my office has produced a solution." Silence. His assistant, a capable young man named Theo, who had developed a survival instinct for these moments, quietly said, "The records exist. They're in Kellerman's compliance archive. We just need someone inside who can pull them and cross-reference the account structure against our filing, then get someone inside. Kellerman's compliance department has a staff of 3. One's on leave. One left the firm 2 weeks ago. The third," Theo glanced at his tablet, "is a junior analyst. She's been there 2 years." Dominic turned from the window. "Junior analyst. Compliance track, Basement office. No client-facing work. Can she do it? Theo hesitated. Her file doesn't exactly suggest. Can she do it or not? Theo looked at the tablet. Her performance reviews say she's methodical, thorough. There's a note from her supervisor last year calling her reliable. Dominic made a sound that was not quite a word, which probably means, Theo said carefully, that nobody has actually looked at what she's done. Harriet was in the middle of reconstructing a 3-year transaction history when her desk phone rang, the landline, which almost never happened, which meant it was either an internal transfer or something strange. It was something strange. Mrs. Odom. The voice was crisp and unhurried. My name is Theo Carver. I'm calling on behalf of Dominic Ashcroft, of Ashcroft Capital. We have an urgent matter involving records held by your compliance department, and we're operating under a significant time constraint. I'd like to ask you a few questions about a specific account cluster, if you're willing. Harriet set down her pencil. How did you get this number? Your firm's internal directory. This is the dungeon line. Nobody calls the dungeon line. A brief pause. I'm calling every line Kellerman has. She almost smiled. What account cluster? He told her. She pulled up the file in her head before he finished the sentence. She didn't need to look, she knew exactly which accounts he was describing because she'd been looking at them since Tuesday. The shell architecture. The 47 million. That's a sensitive area, she said, very carefully. I understand. We're not asking for anything outside your compliance access. We need cross-reference transaction records going back 36 months, mapped against a specific filing structure. Our SEC inquiry opens in 48 hours. Yes. She paused. You know the records you're asking about are flagged. Another silence, slightly longer this time. Flagged how? It wasn't a question. He already knew, or suspected, or was testing her. Harriet had spent enough time reading documents written in careful, evasive language to recognize when someone was doing it in real time. Come down to the dungeon, she said. Bring whoever you need. I'll have the full cross-reference ready in 2 hours. She hung up before he could ask what she meant by dungeon. Theo arrived with 2 people she didn't know, and a tablet he kept glancing at, like it might spontaneously give him better news. They stood in the doorway of the basement office, looking at the drop ceiling and the flickering light, and the institutional carpet that had been grey in a previous decade, and was now the colour of old regret. Harriet had pushed her lunch to the corner of her desk. Mrs. Odom, Theo said. He was younger than she'd expected. He had the look of someone who had learned to run very fast in dress shoes. Thank you for agreeing to sit down, she said, not unkindly. The cross-reference is almost done. Before I hand anything over. She looked at him directly. The accounts your firm needs mapped. You already know they don't belong to Ashcroft Capital. Dead silence. You need them mapped, she continued, because someone used Ashcroft Capital's filing window as a pass-through, and whoever did it knew your audit cycle well enough to time it exactly, which means the 47 million that went through these accounts wasn't your money going out. It was someone else's money being laundered through your firm's legitimate filing structure. She tilted her head slightly. That's what the SEC is actually looking at. Not your records. The person who used your records. Theo had stopped looking at his tablet. The 2 people behind him had stopped looking at anything. You figured that out, he said, slowly. From the Kellerman Compliance Archive. I figured it out on Tuesday. She turned back to her screen. I've spent 3 days building the chain of evidence. Sit down. I'll walk you through it. Dominic Ashcroft arrived 20 minutes later. He did not look like a man who often came down to basement offices. He was tall and angular, with the kind of composed face that people described as hard to read, and he was wearing a suit that cost more than Harriet's monthly rent. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the room, the drop ceiling, the flickering light, the water-stained tiles, and then looked at Harriet, who was standing in front of her monitors with a printed transaction map spread across Earl's empty desk, a red pen in her hand, and a gas station coffee she'd been nursing for 2 hours. She looked back at him without expression. "You're Harriet Odom," he said. "You're late," she said. "Come look at this." Something shifted in his face. Not quite surprise. Something more like recalibration. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the printed map. He was close enough that she was aware of it, but she'd long ago trained herself out of shrinking from proximity, from the reflex to make herself smaller in the presence of someone who took up more official space than she did. She had the map. She had the evidence. She was the one who'd found it. "This cluster," she said, pointing with the red pen, "is where it starts. 3 shell entities registered in Delaware, Wyoming, and the UK. They look unconnected, different registration dates, different registered agents, different industry classifications. But they all use the same underlying payment routing structure." She tapped a sequence of numbers, and they all cleared their transactions through a 5-day window every quarter that lines up exactly with Ashcroft Capital's compliance reporting cycle. Dominic leaned forward slightly. His eyes moved across the map. "How did you find the routing match?" "I built a pattern index for the account cluster back in November. I was looking for something else, a different discrepancy, and I noticed the timing correlation. I set up a flag. Tuesday, it fired." She paused. "Your firm didn't do this. Someone with detailed knowledge of your firm's schedule did this, and they did it knowing that the scrutiny would land on you first, because your filing structure is the one that shows the movement." He straightened, looked at her. "How long have you been building this?" "Seriously, since Tuesday. The framework that caught it about 4 months, in the basement. That's where they put the compliance archive." He held her gaze for a moment longer than felt like routine. Then he turned to Theo. "Get Patricia on the phone. Tell her we have the full chain." Back to Harriet. "Can you compile this into a format that works for the SEC filing?" "It's already compiled. I assumed you'd need it." She handed him a USB drive. "The map is the visual summary. The drive has the full documented chain with timestamps, source verification, and a transaction narrative that a non-specialist can follow." She paused. "I also flagged 3 other account patterns in adjacent Kellerman files that use a similar structure. Different origin, different timing. Possibly connected, possibly not. I thought you should know." Dominic looked at the drive in his hand, then at her. 3 others. They're smaller, but the architecture is the same." He was quiet for a moment, in the flickering light of the basement office, with the copy machine thumping overhead and Earl's motivational cat calendar on the wall behind her. Something in his expression did a thing she couldn't quite name. "Miss Odom," he said, "what exactly do they have you doing here?" She looked around at the stained tiles, the ancient carpet, the desk where she'd eaten a gas station sandwich on Tuesday while uncovering $47 million in financial crime. "Compliance audits," she said, "the ones nobody upstairs wants." The SEC filing went in 16 hours ahead of the deadline. Ashcroft Capital was cleared. The investigation redirected toward the shell entities Harriet had mapped. Within 10 days, 2 of the 3 connected account structures she'd flagged were also under federal scrutiny. Harriet went back to the basement. She did not expect anything to happen. In her experience, the people who found things rarely got credit for the finding. Credit moved upward toward the glass-walled offices and the standing desks and the cold brew subscriptions, where people were visible and legible and presented themselves in the right clothes and the right conference rooms. She was not in a conference room. She was in the dungeon, running a new compliance flag on a suspicious transaction pattern she'd noticed in a quarterly report, eating a different gas station sandwich. Her phone rang. The landline again. Mrs. Odom. That voice. Unhurried. Precise. "This is Dominic Ashcroft." She put down the sandwich. "I know who it is. I'd like to offer you a position." A pause, not a compliment. "There's a distinction." "What position?" "Director of Financial Forensics. It's a new role. I'm creating it because it apparently needs to exist, and because you're the only person I've encountered who could fill it competently." Another pause. "The salary is commensurate with the director level. You'd have a team, a full archive budget, and an office with windows. Functional lighting. Harriet looked up at the flickering fluorescent. What happened to functional lighting being a luxury? I never said that. No, but people who put compliance in basements usually think it. A silence. Then, very quietly, fair point. And she could hear something in it. Not quite amusement, not quite admission, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both. Will you come in? She thought about the 47 million. She thought about the shell entities and the routing structure and the 3 additional patterns she'd flagged that nobody else had seen. She thought about 4 months of building a framework that caught something significant, alone, in the dark, under a flickering light, for no recognition, and a salary that hadn't been reviewed in 2 years. My current salary needs to be more than doubled, she said. Done. I want full independence on investigation targets. No filtering by client relationship. Agreed. And I want Earl promoted to senior compliance analyst before I leave. He's been here 16 years. A pause longer than the others. Done, he said. She looked at the gas station sandwich. Then at the motivational cat calendar. Then at her 3 monitors where a new pattern was just starting to take shape in the numbers. A faint geometric signature she hadn't seen before, something that didn't quite fit, something that wanted finding. I'll start Monday, she said. The first morning she arrived at 7:45 to find that the office they'd given her was on the 14th floor, corner position, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and the city laid out below like a map she already knew by heart. There was a coffee on her new desk. Not gas station, the good kind. She set her bag down and looked at the windows for a long moment. Then she turned on her monitors, pulled up the pattern she'd been tracking since Friday, and got to work. Dominic appeared in her doorway at 9. He did not knock, which she suspected was a habit she'd eventually address. He stood there with his own coffee, looking at her 3 monitors and the printed maps she'd already taped to the wall, and his expression did that thing again. The recalibration, the adjustment, the subtle shift of someone revising a calculation mid-process. You found something already, he said. It wasn't a question. He was learning, she noted, to read her the way she read numbers, looking for the shape beneath the surface, the pattern that didn't announce itself. Maybe, she said. Give me until Thursday. He looked at the maps on the wall, at the color-coded transaction chains, at the careful, precise hand she'd used to annotate the anomalies. Then he looked at her. Thursday, he said. He left without another word, and she turned back to her screens, and the numbers opened for her the way they always did. Not like a door, but like a window, like weather coming, like the shape of a truth that had been there all along, waiting for someone who knew how to look. The city glittered 14 floors below. The coffee was good. The lighting worked. Harriet Odom had always been exactly this. The person in the room who could see what no one else was seeing. It had just taken a while for the room to be worth being in.